Okay, so here we have a circle, and I tried the best as I could to find the center of this circle. But you guys know already that if you start here over at this point over here, and you measure the angle going counterclockwise this way, that the angles get bigger and bigger. So starting from 0, they go up here to this point where the angle is 90 degrees, and then they continue over here to where the angle is 180 degrees. And then continuing, you go down here to this point where it is 270 degrees. And then finally you come back to this point where it was 0, but it's also 360 degrees. So that's a complete circle. Now here's the thing. We are familiar with the equation c equals 2 pi r, where c is the circumference. Of the circle. And what I'd like to focus on is this 2 pi part. So what we're going to say is that that 2 pi part, in whatever unit it is, we'll talk about that in just a moment, is the same thing as 360 degrees. Because 2 pi r represents going all the way around the circle. So we're going to say that that 2 pi also represents going all the way around the circle, as far as the angles are concerned. Now we call this radians. Radians. So another way of saying this is that this point is 0 radians, and then by the time we go all the way around, we end up back here at 2 pi radians. Okay, so that puts us at the same point. Now, what we're going to do is divide that up into 4 parts, just like we took 360 and divided it into 4 parts. Now, you know that 360 divided by 4 is 90, because 36 divided by 4 is 9, right? You know that 360 divided by 2 is 180. You also know that 3 times 90 is 270. So in other words, 1 times 90, 2 times 90, 3 times 90 is 270. So keep those in mind. Okay, so let's do something similar with pi, with 2 pi. So the first thing we're going to do is do 2 pi divided by 4, which we can write as 2 over 4 times pi. And if you reduce 2 over 4, you know that 2 over 4 is the same as 1/2. So we can call this pi over 2. So another way of stating this point is to say pi over 2 radians. Now if we continue, right, that's 1 pi over 2. So now we're going to divide by 2. So 2 pi divided by 2, divide the circle into half, in other words, is the same thing as pi radians. So that means that this thing over here where we have 180 degrees is the same thing as pi radians. Okay, now, I like, when I was a kid, I remember my mother doing a nursery rhyme with me, 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, 4. So I like to count pi over 2's that way. And I say 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. So this is the same thing as 3 pi over 2. And 4 pi over 2, which reduces to 2 pi. So we can divide up this circle into pi radians that way. Now what happens if we want to divide it into further parts? Now we can divide this into 45s. Now you know that 90 degrees divided by 2 is the same thing as 45. Or in other words, 1/2 times 90 is 45. Okay, but if we keep if we think of 90 as pi over 2 instead of 90, this would be the same thing as 1/2 times pi over 2, which turns out to be pi over 4. So we can say that 45 degrees is the same thing as pi over 4 radians. So if we were to draw a line here at 45 degrees, kind of sketchy there, okay, this would be pi over 4 radians, which is the same thing as 45 degrees. So if we're counting by pi over 4s, we have 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4. Over here we would have 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4. Down here we would have 5 pi over 4. This would be 6 pi over 4. 6 pi over 4, by the way, reduces to 3 pi over 2. And then over here we would have 7 pi over 4, if we're counting in radians. Okay, what about 30 degrees or 60 degrees? Well, we know that 360 divided by 6 is the same thing as 60. So if 360 is 2 pi, then we're going to do 1 over 6 times 2 pi, which is the same thing as 2 over 6 times pi, which is the same thing as 1 over 3 times pi, which is the same thing as pi over 3. So every 60 degree mark is going to be pi over 3. Well, what's 1/2 of that? Half of 60 would be 1/2 of 60 is 30. So that's the same as 1/2 of pi over 3. And that turns out to be pi over 6. So over here, this is pi over 6. Okay, so we can measure the circle angles in terms of pi radians instead of degrees, right? So we have pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, and if we go all the way around, we get back to 2 pi.